Hello again. Tonight, I have the pleasure of joining beloved Professor and Associate Dean of Academic Affairs, Adele Amos, in honoring the recipient of this year's David Broward Lifetime Achievement Award. Each year, the students of Land, Air, Water present this award to an activist or attorney, or activist attorney, whose life and career exemplify David Broward's spirit and accomplishments. David Broward was a world-class mountaineer, a visionary leader, and a passionate activist. He was the first executive director of the Sierra Club, founder of Friends of Earth and the Earth Island Institute, and also became the grandfather of PIELC for many years. David Broward believed that true progress will come when we improve our ability to think in radically new ways. He said, "We must begin thinking like a river if we are to leave a legacy of beauty and life for future generations." Consistent with this year's theme of changing currents and David Broward's imperative, the award that we present tonight is a piece of rubble, a remnant of the former Elwha Dam. From time immemorial, the Elwha River watershed was home to 6 anadromous fish species and to the people of the lower Elwha Clallam tribe. A wave of dams electrified the country in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and in a rush to ride this wave, the Elwha Dam's private financiers cut corners during its construction and broke the law by building a dam without fish passage. In its early years, the dam helped promote economic growth on the Olympic Peninsula, but quickly became obsolete as the growth outpaced its capacity. The river didn't take long to decide that it didn't want this dam. As the reservoir began to fill behind the dam in 1912, the river sensed its structural weakness and burst through, taking out a bridge in its rage as it rushed towards the mouth. In 1913, as the reservoir finally rose behind the reconstructed dam, the people of the lower Elwha Clallam tribe mourned the loss of their homes, their land, and the fish that nourished their bodies, culture, and spirits. The salmon and steelhead that called the Elwha River home didn't want the dam either. Year after year, they returned to the river and swam up to the dam, beating their heads against its bottom. Even as their numbers dwindled from 400,000 to less than 4,000, these fish, who had never seen the pristine headwaters and soft gravel beds of the upper Elwha, craved the spawning grounds of their ancestors. As David Broward said, a river is not just an accident, it knows what to do. Well, it took a century to accomplish what the river, the salmon, the lower Elwha Clallam, and many others knew was right from the start, to set the river free. This small chunk of concrete represents the beautiful legacy of a collaborative effort to remove the dam, restore the fish, and help heal the Elwha River and its people. An effort to transition from a history of construction and destruction to a future of restored ecosystems, restored treaty relationships, and restored hope.
What beautiful remarks Malia, and what a perfect tribute to tonight's honoree. Someone who knows well what it means for salmon to return home, for a people like the lower Elwha Clallam tribe to belong to a place along a river, and someone who understands in deep currents what it means for a river to know what to do. I feel so privileged and honored to have been asked to share a few words about the recipient of the David Broward Lifetime Achievement Award this evening. I suspect that nearly everyone in this room tonight has been moved by her work, and I am grateful to count myself in those ranks. She is a nationally and internationally known scholar who purposely places herself on the leading, and as she would say, sometimes rough edge of environmental and natural resources law. She has an expansive legal mind and intentionally chooses projects that some would describe as impractical, unrealistic, or politically naive. But she knows better, and we are lucky that she has the courage of those convictions. working only on ideas that cause us to rethink the fundamental ways we conceive of our obligations and duties to protect and preserve this precious planet and the resources on it. She spends her time and energy on innovative theories of law, paradigm shifts, ideas that have the power to transform and save our collective future. She has created a body of groundbreaking work that forces us to consider what it means for there to be a public trust, and what it means for our governmental leaders to take those responsibilities seriously, and for us as citizens to demand nothing less. Her most recent work on the public trust grows out of a lifetime's understanding and respect for Indigenous knowledge. She tells the story of realizing at a very young age, along the banks of the Columbia River, that tribal life ran ancient in the region, and that the non-Indians, like herself, were newcomers. As she moved into a career of teaching environmental law, she never lost that insight. Her work embraces the profound wisdom that can be found in Native and Indigenous thinking about how to conceive of our relationship with Mother Nature. Traditions of Native stewardship that form the deepest roots of what it means to sustain resources for future generations. She is a disruptor, someone with the courage to force systems that have always worked one way, like our system of environmental laws, to work another way. And perhaps most importantly, with the courage to say when that system is broken and failing. Her most recent work, Nature's Trust, has been described by Gus Speth as doing for environmental protection what Rachel Carson's Silent Spring did for environmental awareness. Speth recognizes that she calls for a revolution in environmental policy and law by challenging our government to fulfill its age-old responsibility as trustee of our public resources. As David Broward would have said, I think, a radically new way of thinking. Kathleen Dean Moore, a keynoter at this conference this year, has noted with regard to her work that at pivotal points in Western history, thinkers have come forward with new catalyzing principles that change the world. Tonight's awardee represents the best of what it means to be a thinker, in my view, because she can move those thoughts into action. She uses her extraordinary intellect to do something even more extraordinary. She teaches and inspires others to become thinkers as well. She moves others to use their minds and their talents to make the world a better place. It is one thing to expand one's own mind to one's own credit. It is quite another to help others expand their minds and find their way to making change. She has committed her professional life to education, spending decades inspiring not just law students, winning the law schools and the university's most distinguished teaching awards, but also community members, undergraduates, neighbors, colleagues, and perhaps most importantly, young people. Just this weekend, earlier today in fact, in speaking with prospective students about what it means to attend UO Law School, and knowing I'd be delivering these remarks tonight, I could feel her influence anew on my own life, and my own words as I shared what sets this place apart, that we are about impact and change and believing that it's all possible, and that the law, even at its most fundamental, like the ancient doctrine of public trust, gives us a way forward. Tonight's awardee, as my teacher, set those notions at the foundation of my career as a lawyer and educator. Like David Broward, she has inspired a whole generation to believe that they can make a difference, that their creative and innovative potential can be put into action. Just as David Broward stood watch over this conference in its early years and supported the ideas that were imagined and the plans that were hatched, tonight's awardee carries on that tradition. In preparing for tonight, I found a letter I wrote as a new lawyer about my teacher in 2001, and the words remain true today. She taught me that academic life should ultimately generate ideas and strategies for making a difference in the real world. Certainly, she practices this every day. In another letter from her student, and now her colleague Heather Britton, she says, beyond her extraordinary intellect, she inspired us to pursue careers in public interest environmental law because she continually demonstrated her genuine belief that we can change the world. For those of us who have been in her classes, worked on a project, attended a lecture, participated at a workshop or a strategy session, you know this to be true. She has a way of making us believe that it is possible to move forward in another, better way, and against what seem to be unbeatable odds. In her own words, and as she lives her own life, we must wake it, teach it, preach it, plant it, enforce it, write it, till it, build it, and all live it now. It's my personal and professional privilege and joy to work with her every day. And tonight it's so exciting to present this award. Please join me in recognizing and thanking the 2015 recipient of the David Broward Lifetime Achievement Award, Professor Mary Christina Wood.
A surprise. And, I have to gain some composure before I even begin to thank you, but holding this rebel in my hand makes me feel great, knowing that it's a dam that came down and those fish are flowing and swimming freely. That's awesome. I just want to say, of course, I don't think I deserve this. This is such a great honor, and I just work with people. The colleagues I have are the pillars of my strength and my ideas. They are the visionaries that I learn from, the visionaries I teach with. They inspire me, they embolden me. Nothing I do is anything of a single effort, of course. And the greatest heroes, too, that I have are the attorneys that take ideas that I write down and they actually move forward and implement them and bring actions in the law that make a difference. Because I confess to you, I have a little bit of a reputation of thinking up ideas and then everybody has to do the work to implement them. So I'm back up. But our children's trust and all those attorneys around the country and all the world now, including students at University of Oregon interning and externing with that organization, taking that idea of atmospheric trust litigation forward. They are my heroes. They're doing this work. And I think I just have to thank my family. And now I understand why my husband and 3 boys happened to show up tonight. You know, someone said, oh, I saw your husband, 3 boys. I said, yeah, that was at noon. I made them come. And whoever was, it's a fog now, said, no, I think I just saw them. I said, no, that's not true. So thanks for coming. I grew up in a family that believed in a trust. I grew up with the mentality of a trust. And my grandfather lived with Chief Joseph, the great leader of the Nez Perce Indians, for a short time when he was a boy, when he was about the age of my middle son. And so I have this family history that was sort of influential. We stayed at the same place on the river. And I heard stories of my father telling me of the great salmon runs on the Columbia River. And I would hear these growing up, and that was before any of the dams. And he would talk about, as a boy, he would go down to the cannery, and there would be fish piled high to the ceiling. And he would go out and fish and just haul in tons of fish, and there'd fish everywhere. And then the dams went in, and he was crushed by the dams. And I've talked to so many Indian people whose lives were devastated by those dams. And I often thought when I was growing up, why couldn't I just have the honor and privilege of seeing what he saw? And so I grew up with the idea, with the moral compass given to me by my family, that all of this is not ours to destroy, this is ours to protect. And the greatest fulfillment you can have beyond loving your family is to protect the nature that you love, so that future generations will love it too. And so I grew up knowing my ancestors and thinking of my descendants sort of in the same vein. I mean, it wasn't just me out there. It was my ancestors, me, my identical twin, and our descendants. And so that's how I grew up, and I think I was very privileged to do that. And I think finally, thankfully, because of the indigenous leadership and wisdom that is voiced out there, and then some of the wisdom from communities that are non-indigenous, I think finally we're all beginning to wake up to this trust in our hearts, not just in the law. So I can't thank you enough for this great privilege. I've always dreamed of the dams coming down, and I will treasure this moment, and I will treasure the words of my wonderful colleague, Adele Amos. Thank you so much, everybody, for this.
And now, if she's up for it, to announce our very first keynoter of the night is the 2015 recipient of the David Broward Lifetime Achievement Award. Oh my goodness.
Well, I now have such a great honor of presenting someone who has been my hero for quite a number of years. Someone who I read about years ago as she was just beginning her campaign and her fight against the devastation of the nature's trust in her area of the world. And it is the highest compliment I think I can give to say that this woman must be the fracking industry's worst nightmare. She is a lawyer from upstate New York, where she has not only been fighting on the front lines of the fracking battle, but she has defined those front lines through her creative thinking and pioneering strategies. And she is now well known across the country for fighting fracking proposals through local zoning ordinances. She is the primary architect of local fracking bans adopted now in over 175 towns across New York State. Helen Slottje was not always in the slum work. Before 1999, she would have been introduced to you as a corporate lawyer with a degree from University of Pennsylvania and a year spent at Harvard Law School. And then someone who worked at a law firm in Boston with a practice that focused on bankruptcy, commercial real estate, and failing banks. In 1999, however, she moved to upstate New York to an area known for its quiet rural landscapes and the scenic Finger Lakes. In 2009, Helen attended a community meeting about gas drilling. And she had seen the energy lease signs on many of the farms throughout the area. What she learned at that meeting horrified her, because below the surface of this lovely upstate New York region beyond lies the Marcellus Shale, the largest known deposit of underground shale gas in the United States. The practice of fracking was already devastating landscapes, and water sources of many local communities across the United States. So Helen resolved to act on behalf of these threatened communities, and she founded the Community Environmental Defense Center. She turned from a corporate lawyer to a land use expert. She traveled all around the state educating citizens on their local powers, crafting local fracking bans, moratoria, and where necessary, bringing lawsuits. She provided hundreds of hours of pro bono legal help at community meetings, and now just a few years later, over 175 towns in New York have fracking bans based on her innovative legal framework. And these bans put overwhelming political pressure on the state of New York to pass its statewide fracking moratorium. So needless to say that battles like this against powerful and often relentless industries require citizens and leaders to summon their courage to fight this environmental oppression, to persevere through all the setbacks, and then to rally when all seems hopeless, especially when all seems hopeless. For years, fracking loyalists harassed and threatened and tried to intimidate Helen, but I have the distinct sense that their tactics backfired. Today, Tony Opoza, recipient of the Svetlana Kravchenko Award, said, "To save the earth, we do not need to change minds, we need to change hearts." Helen not only originated a brilliant legal strategy to fight fracking, but she obviously won the hearts of communities throughout New York State. And in 2014, she was named the North American winner of the prestigious Goldman Environmental Prize. So please join me in welcoming Helen Slottje.
So what I wanted to talk about tonight is sort of our story from New York, how we made progress, the ultimate, where we are and where we hope to go. So over 50 years ago, Rachel Carson opened her revolutionary book, Silent Spring, describing an idyllic countryside where all life lived in harmony, with verdant hillsides, freely flowing trout, and bird migrations that drew spectators from afar. This aptly describes upstate New York, where I am from. The hillsides are dotted with vineyards, small farms, and there are waterfalls and streams that rush to fill the clean water lakes. The breezes are refreshing and wildlife flourishes. Carson's fable goes on to describe a strange blight, an almost evil spell that crept up over the countryside in her book. Under this spell, cattle and sheep sickened and died. Farmers spoke of strange illnesses among their families. The throbbing sounds of the birds were gone. In 1962, Rachel Carson was able to say that this town did not exist outside of her story, but that she was sounding the alarm of the dangers we faced as we moved from a time where life was ruled by the environment to a new age where humans had acquired significant power to alter the nature of the earth and were in fact waging a war on nature. Carson warned that this war against nature was not a war that we wanted to win, and we would sacrifice our own existence if we did. Failing to heed Carson's warning some 50 years later in America, the fossil fuel industry has rolled out fracking across innumerable countrysides without concern for the deadly impacts of their chemicals on water, air, and soil. And in so doing, much of Carson's dystopian nightmare has come to pass. And while the fossil fuel interests have defended fracking by rolling out the same playbook so successfully honed by the tobacco and chemical companies, deny, discredit, and delay, we have the situation here where we have the chance to stop that and to make a difference. So turning to fracking, I wanted to first start by saying what I mean when I talk about fracking, because it's not the same thing that industry means when they talk about fracking. I'm talking about the entire process. As Sandra Steingraber has put it, the entire enchilada, the whole enchilada. So from the process of clearing the land, to decimating forests, to clearing and destroying agricultural lands, and even residential areas. And there are times when local regulations might require to have noise reduction equipment and the like. That is unusual and only happens when the drilling company is obliged to comply. And the clearing of land is not limited to well pads. Gargantuan open pits are constructed, often lined with plastic that's not much thicker than a garbage bag. And not to mention equipment, pipe, and chemical storage. And after the well pad is completed, 5 to 7 million gallons of water must be hauled to the site, and with hundreds and hundreds of tanker truck trips back and forth. And the truck traffic isn't just limited to water tankers. Heavy trucks travel down small rural roads to transport construction equipment, drill rigs, and other equipment and chemicals to the well site, and then to come back and move the equipment and the waste fluid. Over 1,000 truck trips may be required for a single well, with hundreds and hundreds of truck trips for each successive frac jobs, because they don't just frac these wells once or have just one well on one pad. The water used by fracking is destroyed and never returns to the hydrological cycle. And this water destruction is happening at a time when our freshwater resources are increasingly scarce. The frac job itself requires generating sufficient pressure to blast apart solid rock that is already under tremendous pressure. So you have to generate power greater than that at the deepest parts of the ocean. This involves tremendous resources. And silica sand, much mined in Wisconsin, where they are leveling the sandhills made famous by Aldo Leopold. Wells are often flared in the haste to drill because pipelines are not in place or the natural gas is deemed worthless and burned. When they drill into the shale bed, natural gas comes up along with oil. Natural gas is of course valuable, but right now with the lack of pipelines, much of it is burned up, and according to Bloomberg News in North Dakota, drillers flared almost 30% of the natural gas that they produced per day in January of 2014, about twice as much per day as they burned in the previous 2 years. And in some areas, it's much more. At the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation, tribal members have said that as much as 70% of the gas from the wells is flared. And some have said that the North Dakota flares are on a level equivalent to Russia's natural gas production. Explosive oil drilled from these shale gas wells is moved by rail. And it's estimated that 9 million barrels of crude oil are moving over the rail lines of North America at any given moment. A continental oil boom and lack of pipeline infrastructures have forced unprecedented amounts of oil onto U.S. and Canadian railroads. And it's seen in the last 3 weeks, we've had 3 oil train explosions. So with all of this with fracking, what could possibly go wrong? So we've had oil trains charging through Virginia, North Dakota, Alabama, Canada's Quebec, New Brunswick, and Alberta, where trains have exploded and caused severe environmental damage, and in the case of Quebec, considerable human casualties. What else could go wrong? Well, truck accidents, and more truck accidents, cases of water contamination, health and safety issues, spills, explosions, and earthquakes. Not to mention road damage, dust, noise, dangerous jobs. I could go on, but I hope this gives you the flavor of what those who are experiencing fracking are going through and the damage that this wreaks on communities, on the very fabric of communities. So in 2009, I attended my first gas drilling meeting, and at that point I wasn't an activist, I wasn't an environmentalist, I wasn't even actively practicing law. But I'd heard enough rumblings, so I was concerned. I went one town over to a forum. I saw pictures, much like the ones that I showed you here tonight. And I didn't need to be a scientist or a geologist or an engineer to figure out this was a bad idea. And that this sort of land use would literally demolish the communities and the places that I loved. But we were told, like so many other places across the country and across the globe, that fracking was coming. We might as well get used to it because there was nothing we could do to stop it. And so we considered sort of what can we do? What options do we have? And so there was the option of private rights, trying to either enforce leases or get people out of leases, environmental laws at either the federal or state level, regulations, or what the state might do. Except we learned quite quickly that the system wasn't fair and that the industry had access to financial resources, freedom from prosecution, the unwillingness of our system to hurt the job creators, and the system has been steadily rigged, and we keep losing. And so it seemed hopeless at the federal and state level. And so we decided that we really, particularly as me and my husband, two people in upstate New York, we weren't going to make progress at the federal, or at that point even at the state level. And so, we couldn't count on people, oh, the state will regulate it, the federal government will regulate it, and as we all know, that's not true. Because suffice to say, the rigging, and that's a polite term for it, has been going on since the very advent of our environmental laws. And the industry enjoys wholesale exemptions from almost all of our environmental laws. So, if we couldn't make private deals, and if we couldn't rely on regulators to protect us, this is how we decided to focus on local communities. So we set out on a bet. And we weren't going to lose. We had a corporate law background where you never tell a client that they can't do what they want to do. You just figure out how to get it done. So we took that same approach. And we have a history of sort of turning things on their head. So on the one hand, we weren't paid. On the other hand, it meant we weren't limited by what a client was willing to pay us. We could work as much and as hard as we wanted without concern for any sort of practical considerations that usually apply. So the primary reason that the big green groups and attorneys and regulators and of course industry said we were powerless was because there was a statute passed at the behest of industry in 1981 after local communities began regulating the industry after a rash of water contamination cases. And what the statute said was that communities could not pass any local law or ordinance that related to the regulation of the oil, gas, and solution mining industries. And so we focused, we were originally actually not even trying to come up with ways to entirely prohibit gas drilling. We were focused on, well, what's a regulation? Is an air quality law a regulation? Is a noise law? Is a lighting law? Is a dust law? What sort of impositions what could a town do to limit the damage that was done to it? So that led us to the question of, well, what does this phrase mean, relating to the regulation? And we looked at the definition of regulating, and it turns out in New York, as well as in other places, there is a distinction between local laws, or laws in general, environmental laws, that regulate the operations of a company, and those that regulate land use. And so looking at our mining law, and looking at even U.S. Supreme Court cases that drew a distinction between environmental regulation and land use planning, our argument was that zoning prohibitions were not a regulation of the industry. And industry thought this was just the stupidest thing that they had ever heard. And that not only was this suggestion a bad idea, not only was it wrong, it was illegal, it was criminal, it was just the worst thing they had ever thought of, and it was just so ridiculous they couldn't even begin to believe it. So we had a difficult job of trying to convince the first towns to pass these laws that outright prohibited gas drilling. And what we did was work with communities in Tompkins County and out by Cooperstown, which is the Middlefield case, and in Sullivan County, to try to build enough momentum to shift the paradigm. So when we first started out, the question was, why on earth would anyone pass one of these laws? Industry's threatening to sue us, so they're going to bankrupt the town, the lights are going to go out. Then it was, well, a couple towns have done this, let's see what happens. Maybe we should do this, we should at least look into it. To now, where communities are asking, why don't we have a fracking ban? And a complete shift in the thinking of how they wanted to approach this. And this did, and we did think that this was not only a local law issue or a local control issue, but that we could use this to demonstrate politically the strength of the opposition to fracking, that this wasn't some tree hugger issue, this wasn't radical hippies that were the only ones that supported this, that these were communities all across our state, elected officials that presumably other elected officials like our governor would not be able to so easily dismiss. So we had some success with that. Industry, of course, sued almost immediately two of the first towns that had passed bans, and they lost at the trial court level. The original, so there were two cases, two companion cases. The first case was Dryden, and that Dryden's near Ithaca, and so in Tompkins County, a hotbed of liberalism. And so they said, well, we lost that case, but that judge is from Ithaca. It's an activist judge, some hippie, we can't count on that. Well, turns out the judge was from one county over in Portland County. He was a Republican. And the first time I called him an ex-Marine, but I've since been corrected, there are no ex-Marines, there are only Marines. So this was a 50-year-old white Marine Republican. So not exactly your typical hippie from Ithaca. And so well, fine, we'll wait for the next case to come down. The Middlefield decision came down 2 days later. They lost that case at the trial court level. They said, well, that's another activist judge. It turned out he was not from Cooperstown. He was from one county over, some 50-ish-year-old white man. It's like, probably not a total hippie. And so they said, well, we'll appeal this. We're going to appeal, and we wait for these lower court decisions don't count. And mind if they'd won, that would have been the end of the story. But since they lost, don't pay any attention. We're going to appeal, and we're going to win on appeal. So you towns shouldn't do anything until you hear more from us. So they appeal. They lost at the appellate division, a 3-0 decision. And they said, well, they just don't understand industry. They don't get it. But we really need to take this to the Court of Appeals. And by the time and the Court of Appeals is our highest court in New York. And by the time they got to the Court of Appeals, they were starting, somewhat belatedly, to take this seriously. So they called in the lawyers for the chamber, the National Chamber of Commerce, API, it's a tremendous number of industry briefs saying that the world was going to end if New York communities could actually decide what they wanted to have happen in their towns, and much to their chagrin and much to our great pleasure and a little bit of gloating, the Court of Appeals said, no, these are just zoning laws, and there would be no reason for the oil and gas industry to have an exemption from land use laws that not one other industry has. We would, if that was the case, surely the legislature would have made that very clear. They would have at least discussed it at some point, and there's nothing in the record that shows they ever even talked about zoning. And the Court of Appeals went on to say that basically zoning is the foundation of a civilized form of existence, which was fundamentally our theory, that this was just wrong. How could it be that this one industry could come in and just destroy your town and you had no say? And so this made basic sense to us. It, of course, continues to make no sense to industry, but they might not ever get it. So they might say, well, this is this really radical idea, you know, this is New York, you know, might as well be California. But as it turns out, there's a long history of places deciding that they do not want oil and gas exploration close to residential neighborhoods. So in fact, in 1932, in Oklahoma, the governor there had to bring out the National Guard to enforce a local ban on drilling, because the city had said, we've had enough of this, we don't want any more drilling inside the city limits. They passed a law, it was legal, and the companies, surprise, surprise, decided that that law didn't really apply to them, and so they brought out the National Guard in Oklahoma to shut down the oil fields. And that continues to be the law in Oklahoma, in fact. So when we went out, my husband David and I do this work together. We picked our name, Community Environmental Defense Council, to kind of sound like a whole bunch of other things that we weren't. And so that people would say, oh yeah, I've heard about you guys. I doubt it. As long as you think so. And so this past summer, he was out in Oklahoma, and industry, they learned about it ahead of time. It was like a 350, 400 person forum where they were holding this, and they packed it with industry supporters. They got there hours and hours ahead of time. And the industry sent a representative who was just adamant that it was, why were we even talking about home rule in Oklahoma? Like, it just didn't even exist. Apparently not bothering to read either the cases from the Oklahoma Supreme Court that have said that there's the right to restrict gas drilling, and the opinion of their Attorney General. So this isn't really this very radical, unheard of idea. It's just a shifting in how we think about this and stopping to sort of question the assumptions and to look at it. And it's not even limited to places like Oklahoma. I was in Montana, looked at what Montana law was like, and they have embedded in their constitution the right to a clean and healthful environment. There's a limited number of other states, including Vermont and Virginia, that have these kind of provisions. And so while New York's particular approach is unique to New York law, we believe that in almost any state there are avenues and ways to use local laws to get it at the root of this problem. So in Oklahoma, it would be their rights that the Supreme Court, the statutes, and their Attorney General have set forth. In Montana, it's this constitutional right to a clean and healthful environment. In West Virginia, of all places, they even talk about how the government is a trustee and the servant of the people. And the Constitution actually goes on to talk about how if people don't like the government, they can just dissolve it and form a new one, which I don't think the people in West Virginia want to talk about too much. And then even separate and aside from these traditions of local land use law, environmental protections in the Constitution, or the zoning type laws, there are things like air pollution control. And the Clean Air Act specifically does not preempt state or any other government's clean air laws. It sets a floor, not a ceiling. And so in states like New York and Montana, localities actually are granted the power to regulate air pollution at the local level. So there's concurrent federal and state jurisdiction, and then the state decides what powers the local governments do or do not have with regard to air pollution. But there are plenty of states, I haven't looked at all of them, but that actually provide that local governments can pass air pollution laws. And that's primarily one of the things we're trying to get at, are greenhouse gas emissions from pipelines and the like, compressor stations, flaring. And so that's another avenue, using the same sort of thinking and applying the law, going out and searching through the law, looking at all these different options and finding out what works in any particular state. So this isn't just about New York, and it isn't just about fracking. So, what does industry have to say about this? Well, their first argument, and one of my favorites, is that, well, you're just a NIMBY. And, except when I go other places, I'm a carpetbagger. So apparently, I can't win. But my primary argument about being a NIMBY is, well, why wouldn't I be? If I don't want to protect the places where I live and that I love and I care about, who would? If it wasn't me. And so they take sort of this fundamental human feeling and natural attachment to where you live and turn it into a bad word, as only industry is really capable of doing. So their second argument that they sort of trot out is that this is a taking. And so we often think, particularly as lawyers, of property as a bundle of sticks. And you have the right to alienate, you have the right to exclude, and you have all these rights. We don't often think about the obligations that are inherent with those rights, or are part and parcel, or the mirror image. You can't have rights without obligations. But there's no right to pollute. And there has never been the right to take one of your sticks out of your bundle of property rights and poke your neighbor in the eye. But that's just not, you don't have that right. And so this idea that somehow you're taking something away from them because you're not allowing them to pollute your backyard, I think is just ridiculous. It affirmatively makes me angry. And so this process of fracking is not self-contained. It's not limited to one person's yard and, like somehow they tried to originally portray smoking as your own personal decision and didn't affect anybody else. Here, you're not just imposing the equivalent of secondhand smoke on people, but you're destroying public trust resources like the air and water. Literally destroying water. It would be better to take the water that they use for fracking and put it on a rocket ship and send it to the moon than to use it for fracking, because that water is then available to pollute more water. And so this is, just another one of their sort of just entirely specious arguments. So then they'll say, well, this is perfectly safe, and we've been doing this forever. So, well, what does Chesapeake have to say? Well, let me go back here. So they have to make a few disclosures to the SEC, not as much as we would like, but they'll tell the SEC that horizontal fracking is different than the stuff they've been doing for hundreds of years. And one of our favorite people, Audrey McClendon from Chesapeake, will say, and fine, we'll tear up roads, we'll be noisy, we'll create dust, we'll hurt people. Who cares? And sometimes there's a lack of transparency about operations. Well, those are legitimate concerns. So even industry, when pushed, will acknowledge that there are concerns. They just don't think they're very important. So is there anything else to worry about? Risks of fire, blowout, failures, loss of life, more things disclosed in SEC filings that they don't talk about when they come to your town and tell you how this is just the best thing ever. And so they'll also say, well, we have wonderful casing and we have this great protective program. Well, they don't mention that in the first instance when they drill the hole, they have to drill the hole before they put the casing in, and they use drilling mud while they're doing that, so there's no protection during the drilling phase. And then their primary protection is the cement that runs along the side of their steel piping that they smush down into the hole. Well, you cannot change the physical properties of cement simply by passing a law or a regulation. So cement shrinks, cement cracks, cement degrades over time, particularly when you subject it to strong vertical pressures instead of the horizontal pressures that cement is somewhat more designed to accomplish. So, argument number 5, think of all the jobs that you're going to destroy. And in fact, a lot of what oil and gas development does is take things out of the normal cycle of using cotton for fabric or glass or renewable, recyclable processes, and takes that out, uses a ton of more energy, less labor, but more energy, to create one-time use objects. And this, by definition, is creating fewer jobs than if you were involved in clean energy. So this is just another one of their myths. This extraction and reliance on oil and gas actually reduces employment opportunities, and then because there are reduced employment opportunities, that's why we need more oil and gas exploration to further reduce the job opportunities. So, argument number 6, well, even if climate change is real, and I'll get to decide if I believe in it or not, because it's a religion, they'll say, well, if there is such a thing as climate change, if we really have to worry about this, we are way better than coal. Well, good for you. That's like, I don't even want to start with that. So, but it's not like we're using less coal because we're using natural gas. We're simply ripping up as much coal as we ever did and just shipping it off to China. So it's not reducing emissions in any meaningful way. And furthermore, so because it's just not going to make a difference on the climate change, even with our most optimistic estimates, because methane is so powerful a greenhouse gas in the short term. So another one of their fun arguments is, well, it's a bridge fuel. We need this, it's a bridge. They've been building this bridge since 1981. It's going nowhere. And so they say, well, we understand, maybe we need to stop using fossil fuels, but we can't quit now. And so, but what you need to, or the way I think about this is this sort of evocative term of stranded assets. We've basically built into our economic system the full value of all known reserves that are on these companies' books. So when you value ExxonMobil or Chevron or these companies, their valuation is based on oil that's still in the ground. That's their sort of capital or their trade in stock. So if they can't take that out of the ground, they lose money, and that's not how they like to operate. So it really is not, when they talk about a bridge, they're simply talking about continuing to use and be addicted to their product. So sometimes we'll say, oh, we need to have signs. I've taken most of them down in New York, but drill a well, bring a soldier home. And it's patriotic. So I don't know, as between listening to some propagandist or Rex Tillerson, perhaps the CEO of Exxon, he says consistently and repeatedly that there is no way we are ever going to stop importing fuel. And one of the main reasons for that, and the reasons why even in 1973, why we had the original energy crisis, was because our energy companies could produce energy overseas for much less money than in the United States due to tax write-offs and things like that. And so they pursued their profits. And then when OPEC wanted to retaliate against the United States, our friendly, patriotic energy companies acquiesced and did not insist on production, even though they owned a lot of the wells that OPEC was talking about. So this idea, energy companies want imports. They're cheaper for them, it's a way to make profits, they own assets overseas. So this is not about being patriotic. Or if it's not bring a soldier home, it's somehow this idea of energy independence. We're going to be an island in America and we're not going to need any of these expensive foreign imports. Well, once again, this is simply a charade. It's masquerading as an energy policy. We're just giving cover to them. We declared energy independence as a goal in 1973, and it's just another one of their just patently false statements that sound great. Okay, well then, fine, but it's cheap. And so, and it's going to be cheap for America. Well, they're not intending, as we know from the LNG export facilities and the like that are planned, the idea here is not to provide a bunch of cheap energy to the United States. The idea is to export this overseas. And so you might ask, well, why are we so interested, and why is our State Department so interested in exporting natural gas? Well, the State Department has said that they created this Bureau of Energy Resources for the purposes of channeling the domestic energy boom into a geopolitical tool. So now we can use, Robert McNally, a former energy advisor to George W. Bush, talks about how shale gas is a new weapon in the arsenal of democracy. So, and then one of my personal favorites, well, it's risky, but we all take risks. You drive, you fly, and I think there's a fundamental difference between risk you consent to, risks that you voluntarily take, risks that you know what the risks are, you have the information to make the decision, and you benefit from the risk. When one person pays the cost and the other person benefits, that's not a risk, that's just theft. So why the big push for fracking? Again, I believe it really, the reason why the companies want to do it is for the money. The reason why our federal government and why Obama and Hillary Clinton in particular think this is such a great idea is this idea of using this to exert pressure on Russia and China. And so we're using this, so the idea is to use fracking as this weapon, and we're literally going down in flames with, directing this weapon against ourselves. So where do we go from here? What are we to do? So I think that we need a fundamental shift in the way we think about our economy, about where we live, about the future that we want. And we seem to have this idea that somehow, and hear it all the time, that we're divorced from nature, or the environment is some place you go visit on the weekends. But we are, and that we're unlimited. But in fact, we are dependent upon having a place to grow food, having air to breathe, having soil that's productive, having water that we can drink. This sort of fantasy that we'll just make a big bubble and we'll live inside the bubble and technology will protect us and we're completely detached is just a deeply flawed idea. And so the shift of thinking about the commons and the public trust and this longer term view is really where we need to be headed. And part of that is thinking about why do we have government in the first place? And the fossil fuel industry will tell you, well, the reason why we have government is so I can make money. Most of us, if you think back, to sort of, I don't know, Democracy 101 and the social contract and all of this, the point of having a government, the point of society is really for human benefit, for society to flourish, for there to be a future for humans and for all other species. I mean, at this point, I'd just stick with the other species. But, but what we need to do, I think, is to reclaim our power, both literally and figuratively. The energy companies are deeply determined to keep us hooked on their product, and they'll do anything to keep us feeding at the trough. They bought out and dismantled the electric trolleys. They built cars that were big and heavy because Henry Ford said, mini cars mean mini profits. They killed the electric car, and they're trying to kill distributed electric solar power. So my thinking is that we need to get mad, we need to take it personally, and we need to demand change. And that it is possible for us to leave a healthy planet for our children, but we need to act now.
To introduce our next keynote speaker, I'd like to welcome Ashley Carter, a third-year law student, to the stage. It's my honor to introduce Derrick Evans to you this evening. Derrick Evans is a sixth-generation native of Turkey Creek, an historic African-American community on the coastal Mississippi. Founded in 1866, Turkey Creek was one of the first African-American communities established after African-Americans were freed from slavery, and Derrick's great-great-grandfather was one of the founders. Turkey Creek is now a strong community of about 400 people, and is rich not only in its legacy and culture, but also in its natural swamp and wetlands, and the unique fauna and flora native to those environments. Raised in Turkey Creek, Derrick eventually moved to Boston to pursue his bachelor's and master's degrees from Boston College, where he taught civil rights history as an adjunct professor from 1992 to 2005. Derrick also taught American history and social studies in the Boston public school system from 1991 to 2001, taught history and African American studies at Roxbury Community College, and in 1997, co-founded the Epiphany School, a full-service and tuition-free independent middle school for low-income children in Boston neighborhoods. In 2001, Derrick returned to Turkey Creek with his friend and filmmaker, Leah Mahan, to record his family history. What he saw when he returned would alter the direction of his life dramatically. Turkey Creek was, and still is, surrounded by the continuously expanding city of Gulfport, which is known for its gaming, industry, and tourism. When Derrick returned to Turkey Creek, he began to use historic preservations and environmental legal requirements to fight off development that would have ruined the Turkey Creek community. Although I haven't previously met Derrick before tonight, it was about a year ago that I first got to hear his story in a documentary on Turkey Creek he and Leah produced, called Come Hell or High Water, The Battle for Turkey Creek. And every time I watch this documentary, there are lessons that are re-emphasized, re-engraved, captured well from a few excerpts from the film. Referring to developers, people can do anything they want if nobody don't try and do nothing about it. Development is a good thing when it happens in a way that helps the people who are already there
stay there. Environmentalists aren't born, they are made by necessity. Environmentalists in Turkey Creek were certainly made by necessity. Derrick and other community leaders have come together to fight for and save their land and culture from development. And at the same time, they've organized outlets for others to do the same. Derrick is a co-founder of several organizations, including Turkey Creek Community Initiatives, which works to conserve and restore the culture and ecology of Turkey Creek community and watershed. Gulf Coast Fund for Community Renewal and Ecology Health, which directs financial, technical, and collegial support to grassroots community groups, addressing the region's challenges of poverty, racism, gender inequality, and environmental destruction. And Bridge the Gulf, a community media project that bridges the voices of the Gulf community, working towards justice and sustainability to the forefront. And now Derrick told me that all three organizations are now joining forces in the Gulf Coast Community Initiatives. These outlets are important models because there are Turkey Creeks all over the country. The same struggle, that struggle against pro-corporate narrow-mindedness that is happening in Turkey Creek is happening all over the Gulf, in places like the Lower Ninth Ward and across the country, and right here in Oregon, in places like Cedar Valley, as some of you may have heard in today's earlier panel. Derrick and what he's doing in Turkey Creek is a powerful example we can learn from. This example is providing lessons on how to organize and plan to ensure environmental justice and social justice in our communities. Come hell or high water, the battle for Turkey Creek will be screened in a panel tomorrow morning. I hope you come and witness Derrick's story and the story of Turkey Creek. And now, please join me in welcoming Derrick Evans.
All right, what an honor, in more ways than one. This is my first trip to the Pacific Northwest, except for once there was a layover at SeaTac. But other than that, this was it. And I was blessed this morning, coincidentally, to wake up, not this morning, yesterday morning, just a couple hundred yards from the mouth of the Elwha River. Yeah, and so the award presentation tonight really hit me, and I just envy your piece of welcome. And I was there to speak at a small community college in Port Angeles, in a longhouse. It was great. And then I drove down, and here I am now. And thank you for having me. Obviously, I am not a law student. I'm not a lawyer, a legal scholar, or a judge, despite appearances, right? But, and in fact, honestly, I don't really readily describe myself or think of myself as an activist or an organizer. But really, just a guy from Turkey Creek who fell in love as a kid with community and American and human history. And accidentally became a school teacher. So more than anything, I'm an educator. I'm also somebody who changed schools 13 times before graduating from high school in 1984, which is why I actually believe that our world is one great big middle school cafeteria. Right? With all of the cliques, insecurities, right? Personal agendas and vendettas for which adolescence is so well known, right? Having said that, I think that's a good intro to what I want to do next. I want you to understand that I returned to Turkey Creek after over 20 years of not living there. Turkey Creek is in Mississippi. This is the state flag of Mississippi. Okay. All right. Turkey Creek is a place for a variety of reasons, or I should say Mississippi is, like a lot of places in this world, that a lot of people who do get educated and go on and experience education or professional opportunities in other places don't often return home. And that's tragic. That's not a good thing. There's a lot of reasons for that. And I had every intention earlier in my life of being one of those people. But in 2001, while I was teaching, I had done a research on the Eyes on the Prize film series about the civil rights movement, 14-hour series. And I was teaching civil rights history as an adjunct professor at Boston College, which is my alma mater, and teaching history in the Boston Public Schools. And had become a small residential landlord in the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston. Had a community garden, great neighbors. No reason in the world, really, to leave Boston, Massachusetts, except for the fact that the place that I was from, Turkey Creek, that in so many ways made me who I was, and which I had learned over time to lament that other people no longer had access to the Turkey Creeks that they were from in Onondaga County, New York, where I've also attended school. Third grade, Sewell Royal Elementary in Liverpool near Lake Onondaga, and Brick City in Syracuse. So, Turkey Creek, of course, to me, being a sixth-generation descendant of former slaves, right? After 14 generations of slavery, I'm the sixth generation, sort of like an iPhone, right? I'm the G6 of a free African-American person. And one of the only 6 of those 20 generations, in many instances, have a first and last name, right? Access to the human and the civil right to own property, to attend school, to vote, what have you. So when I woke up to the fact that Turkey Creek was situated, as many communities have been since before the founding of this republic, located in the quote-unquote wrong place for other people's designs, right, or plans for the future, I had no choice but to go home and find out what's going on and what might I be able to do to help. And of course, originally, I thought one set of things, or one set of relationships and trainings and experiences that I had had up to that point were going to dictate what I was going to dictate, right, to be what my community needed. But nothing could have been further from the truth. And what I discovered in Turkey Creek, and I couldn't have imagined, was a list of community ailments that read like the Book of Job, and most of which lie way outside of my knowledge of science, law, even American history, which I have a master's degree in American history. And it was a mess. And I gradually realized that a big part of the mess was environmental. In fact, and then I realized that a big part of the environmental mess is that environmentalism, like so many other traditions, if you will, is at times harmfully bifurcated, right, and not cross-fertilizing with its own self. And like others, I began to see that, as in other cases, a lot of times there's circling of wagons to shoot inward, right? And that's not so good. But in Turkey Creek, I discovered that there were, what you might say, just as so many problems means that many or more number of possible solutions and possible contributors to those solutions, right? So that's the way you turn that around to begin with. And what I realized was that environmentally, this was a matter of, we're going to need environmental lawyers. We're going to need environmental, non-litigious, right? Is that a word, litigious? Oh, see, I'm in luck. Environmental educators, right? Environmental conservationists, land trusts, people that actually practice conservation and restoration of our natural resources. And those are in and of themselves, right? Traditions, right? And there was also this tradition, this more recent tradition of environmental justice, right? Which of course is environmentalism fed helpfully with civil and human rights traditions. Right? So it was a convergence place, right? My ancestral home was also a modern convergence place of just those environmental, if you will, traditions and potential solutions and contributors. The whole gamut of which I had not previously ever been exposed to or thought might have anything to do with essentially a civil rights Mississippi type of frame, which is where I was coming from. So why don't we pause here, and I'll share with you a short piece from the Daily Show with John Stewart that features my beloved Turkey Creek. While we're waiting for that, I'll open it up by saying it bears out the wisdom of
that reports on a new board.
my mother's theory that when people make a circle that excludes you, you make a bigger circle that includes them.
Turkey Creek, Mississippi. Founded by freed slaves in 1866, it's been a thriving haven for local black residents, which means a dumping ground for everyone else. For 150 years, their lack of political power has made them an inviting target for eminent domain seizure and a handy waste bin for industrial pollution, Agent Orange, and whatever the hell did this.
We've been here for almost 150 years, but entered the 21st century with erasure from the map as the most likely outcome.
To protect what little land was left, they appealed to local officials, state officials, the NAACP, anybody, all to no avail. But then came a savior.
We always look for opportunities to help a community like Turkey Creek. It represents a place where not just resident birds that we see all year, but migrating birds that fly through here on the bay.
What the hell are you talking about?
I'm talking about the birds, these feathered creatures that fly in the sky that also live in Turkey Creek.
Are you kidding me? That's right, the only organization that can help preserve what remains of Turkey Creek.
You're the mother bird people?
The Audubon Society. Residents had turned towards the heavens for help, and their prayers were answered by birds.
When outdoor enthusiasts, when they got involved, just changed things dramatically, I think. We recently were able to force a concession from the state to throw over 1,600 acres into perpetual conservation.
Thanks to the birds.
Birds are very revered in Mississippi.
More than people?
I don't know what to say.
To the Audubon Society's credit, they were even there after Hurricane Katrina ravaged Turkey Creek.
After the hurricane a couple of years ago, we built thousands of these, including in Turkey Creek.
So after Hurricane Katrina, you got people to come out and build homes
For birds.
Only the birds had gotten here a little sooner.
This is about 20% of what was our historic cemetery. Where's the rest of it? It was bulldozed to build the apartments. So the original freedmen and women who created Turkey Creek are under this.
That's right. If this had been a listed, recognized, formally mapped official birding area, none of this would have happened. This wouldn't happen. None of it.
Derrick, hold on for a second.
Sure.
Hey there, Reverend. You busy? Turkey Creek, Mississippi, mean anything to you?
Historic black town.
And nobody could help them but the Audubon Society. You feel a little embarrassed? Maybe you're getting shown up by the birds, man?
No, I think they should be embarrassed that they don't listen to human beings, they listen to birds.
Clearly the birds had proven their value to society, but what could the people offer?
We help them to elevate the importance of this community by providing them sheets and birds in their backyard.
So you taught the direct descendants of slaves to count birds to prove that their homes are worth saving.
That's my mother.
I don't see any birds right here. I hear one.
Now, was this place always called Turkey Creek, or did you change the name to Turkey Creek because nobody would come help when it was called Black People Swamp?
It was
Oh, okay. All right.
But that's anonymous.
Yes, the residents have taken to birding with great enthusiasm.
Wait, look.
Birds got more power to say so than anybody.
Albert's trenchant analysis of race in America made me think, was society still treating me a certain way due to the color of my skin?
I mean, good bars, really? Nice spots? Nothing?
Sorry. Just when I was getting good, right? So long story short, he dresses up like a bird. He goes to the mall, and people, because he's dressed up like a bird, everybody engages him, right? Which they didn't when he was dressed up like himself, this African American person, comical. They don't know who he is. And it's a play on John Howard Griffith's 1950s book, Black Like Me. It was Bird Like Me was the name of this piece. You can watch it again if you like. On YouTube. But the point here is, first of all, Audubon Society wasn't at all. This is comedy. This is irony, parody, whatever. They found us because of the fact that my community, this environmental justice community, this African American community in Mississippi, which is internationally famous for continuous, ongoing civil rights and racial issues, had a community that they heard, among other things, was using the birds who cross the Gulf of Mexico each spring and fall as one of the leverage points that we did begin to, we learned about and used, right, to fight for the community. And so it's really, I mean, thank God for the people from the Audubon Society who initially were interested in the fact that within this rapidly urbanizing area, there did remain this coastal bayou, right, surrounded by an interstate, an airport, a creosote plant, all this other urbanization of the last century, with 200-300-year-old American beautyberry bushes and muscadine vines. That's a birding track. So I had taken this master naturalist class. Mark LaSalle is a great friend of mine. He was my teacher at this master naturalist class that I took, which was ironically funded by Chevron, but you know, the class happened, I took it. So the reason I wanted to start off with showing you this is that it's really important. I think the most important thing that I can share with you is from my experience and my personal growth in learning in Turkey Creek, is the importance of what coincidentally is the theme of this conference, which is changing currents, right? Because what do currents do? They collide and they converge and they change. And I've heard it said several times, think like a river, right? Which means, that's so much more profound than think outside the box, right? Think like a river. And what that means, I think, in human practice, as attorneys, as teachers, educators, historians, social scientists, mothers, fathers, Sunday school teachers, right, is that we need to recognize that no matter where we are, whether we're from there or not, every place is its own convergence of history and traditions and the elements of ancestry, elders, right, traditions, practices, right, shared sense of a common future, hope, some aspirational or even fear-driven collective notion of the future. Again, the middle school classroom, right? And Turkey Creek's no different. So I had to have the patience and the open eyes and ears to try to not only bring to the table the traditions that I had been, right, schooled in or experienced in, like northeastern urban community development type stuff, which is very different in Boston than from Mississippi in many ways. Civil rights history, which by itself wasn't going to change anything, in Mississippi, Turkey Creek, or anywhere else, any more than environmental law by itself is going to change anything, even environmental laws and policies permanently. Because in fact, as I speak, folks are commemorating the 50th anniversary march in Selma, which is a good thing. But it also coincides with, the 1-year anniversary of the gutting of the Voting Rights Act that march occurred and helped to create. And what that says to me is that maybe what we've done over the last 50 years is busted our arms, patting ourselves on the back about making that policy change, which, by the way, was a policy that was actually enacted 100 years earlier. We were only getting back to zero, right? But what we didn't do, in addition to our focus on policy, is to create the cultural attitudinal shift through civil society, education, curriculum development, even the theology in our churches and religious institutions, that would put the kind of feet and spirit under that policy change so that it can never be reversed. This is the problem with American history. We always keep revisiting the same narrow policy debates, right? About race, right? About land use, about environment, and so forth. And so I would say that the point here is for all of us to think like a river, right? And for us, the rivers are the communities and the people and the traditions and the histories that do, in fact, whether we notice it or not, collide and converge and make history with our assistance or resistance, regardless of our designs. So in Turkey Creek, I knew as a history teacher, for instance, how evocative for some people the fact is that the community was born during the Reconstruction after slavery. So for example, after Hurricane Katrina, we had t-shirts that said, "This ain't our first Reconstruction." Right? Or we have a strong faith-based African-American Southern community with a church that always has and always will anchor that community as long as it's there. And so as we gradually discovered environmentalism, we raised about $2,000 for some friends in Boston, created an environmental ministry, and had a bumper sticker that said, "Clean souls need clean water." Right? You follow me here? deal with the traditions and the practices and the community that's there, right? And see what can then be added. Because once you do, you find that there's people who aren't there will find a place. And it becomes a meeting place. And so despite Turkey Creek's list of ailments, remember I said, which also meant a list of possible solutions and contributors, it's only possible by thinking like that river, right? And recognizing the place-based traditions, values, and history, and the possible portals through which other people can enter, right? To help. I didn't know Hurricane Katrina was going to come, but it did. And it brought tens of thousands of volunteers and put Turkey Creek really on the map in ways that it wouldn't have been without Katrina. I didn't know that the BP oil spill was going to happen just due south. The Macondo well is due south of Gulfport, and that it was going to bring in people like Dr. Ricky Ott and Rick Steiner and others who had the experience of that horrible tradition, right up in Valdez and in Port William Sound with the Exxon Valdez spill. And we're able to come and then quickly, because of our already engagement in Turkey Creek and across the Gulf Coast, in intentionally harvesting and bringing together our own traditions across these state lines. Just like hurricanes do not respect the boundary line between Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, right? In fact, those arbitrary lines are drawn more than anything to accomplish the adverse cumulative impact that the Gulf region's the electoral politics cause for the rest of the nation and world. I mean, we send 10, usually consistently 10, rarely less than 9 jerks to the United States Senate that everybody's got to live with from Florida to Texas. Okay? That's one of the many ways in which everyone in here's life, even here in Oregon, is connected to the Gulf Coast. All right? Yeah. So in Turkey Creek, just a quick list of some of those unlikely traditions or practices and resources that we were able to attract to this one little place, right? This one 2,000-acre watershed. The Turkey Creek only runs 13 miles before it reaches the Gulf of Mexico. It's this tiny watershed, tiny, tiny, tiny. Like so many actually on the Gulf Coast, between the river, the Mississippi River, right, and say the Black Warrior. So right in that area, it looks like a little eggshell that's hard-boiled and been cracked, all those little watersheds down there. All of which, by the way, I never knew this stuff, man. I grew up down there taking it for granted, you know, running around in the woods and in the swamps, down out front and in the barrier islands, knowing nothing about the ecological science that I had to learn out of necessity upon coming home and realizing that the Army Corps cared about that stuff when permit applicants filled in the blanks. So I better learn about that stuff too, and get the church to do it, right? And get the NAACP to do it, and get Audubon to come teach us how to find a bird, right? Et cetera, et cetera. You know, marinate here. Let's think like a river, right? So some of those, I mean, the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I mean, you don't think of them typically in a low-income African-American community looking for those historic architectural gems, do you? You know, I think of like the buildings in this country that quite naturally are going to be a priority to preserve for, you know, all of us or for certain groups. I just thought it was a dilettantish diversion for wealthy whites who thought that that was history as opposed to hardcore history of cause and effect, right, and social reality. But in fact, the Historic Preservation Act of 1966 is an invaluable tool for my community. I mean, it's made a huge difference. The Gulf Restoration Network, which I think is here, somebody from GRN. It was a, you know, water quality wetlands, great organization down in the Gulf region, who we teamed up with early on, learned how to file Clean Water Act lawsuits. The Waterkeeper Alliance. I was the original Turkey Creek keeper. You know, I had known Bobby Kennedy for 25 years in a purely different context. And this mayor in our city did something once, and I realized we had a water problem here, and he was the only person who I knew or knew of who made a living or spent his days every day talking about water. So I actually called them and I ended up going to a waterkeeper conference in Montreal, or yeah, it was Montreal, yeah, 2003. So, and the Sierra Club, the local land trust, the Mississippi Coastal Plain, and eventually, once we got all of those together, like, mind you, this is a low-income black community in a tiny watershed in Mississippi. We're not supposed to be the meeting place for all of this stuff, right? But when people realize that we were, guess who then shows up? The state DEQ, the USDA NRCS, HUD, the United States Department of Transportation, right? Candidates for United States president, right? You know, whatever. It's like all roads start leading to Turkey Creek. And I was like, what is this, Nazareth? I mean, you know, right? And that's why when Hurricane Katrina hit, Turkey Creek was something of a very young elder in the modern, recent experience of articulating one's own vision out of someone else's crosshairs. When Katrina hit, whoa, across the Gulf Coastal Plain, communities were displaced socially in every way and environmentally. Now, now this is key. This is what happens when we don't think like a river. All of us got snowed by Katrina, which was never embraced by media, policymakers, or social scientists as the environmental disaster that it was, or the regional disaster that it was. It was a New Orleans housing and community development disaster. So much so that to this day, a hurricane is deemed successful if it misses New Orleans. Right? Well, this was during the time when we realized we can't count on government to think like a river and resource with good ideas or practices. And we can't count on media, and we can't count on philanthropy. So we can't create our own government, but we did create the Gulf Coast Fund for Community Renewal and Ecological Health, a try against tremendous odds, which we still face, to resource the community wisdom and action that community groups on the ground in the Gulf Coast who understand the region socially and environmentally far better than any of our governors or senators or their staff or the businessmen who fund their campaigns, to support their work that the big foundations and others, aren't supporting. Likewise, journalistically, we created the Bridge to Gulf Storytelling and Citizen Journalism Project to share Gulf Coast stories. Why wait for Oprah? To find Bayou Patrick or Turkey Creek or the Lower Ninth Ward, Plaquemines Parish, and it's made a difference. And so in the Gulf region, people have been, I'd say since Katrina, increasingly thinking more and more like a river, And I encourage you to join us, actually, in any number of ways. One, again, for those of you who are current or future practitioners, again, make sure that you not just inherit the traditions of the elders, the lessons learned, and the even current plate tectonics of law, right? Environmental law, which granted, it's got some plate tectonics going on here that we just heard about, literally and figuratively. But also the organic stuff that has to do with community, the places, like where you grew up, that makes a difference. The stories and the relationships of place, the traditions, that is an element, an ingredient, right? And what makes possible the work that you and others do is because there's a connection, right? It's thinking like a river, right? Because honestly, it is the particularities of place, history, identity, and traditions that are going to give us access to the unlikely tools and allies for which the opposition has no playbook. None, right? And which will also, alone, be able to achieve the cultural attitudinal shifts that are needed so that a policy change, well won, well fought, stays. So that the grandkids and the great-grandkids don't have to fight years later, after the national parks movement, to save a mountaintop, right? You ever wonder, why is it that after all of these cataclysmic, episodic disasters and eras of American and Western history, and the Pulitzer Prizes that have been won and so forth, writing about them, and the Nobel Prizes, and the new areas of academic inquiry and study that have arisen, are all of these problems worse? Right? What does that say about us as a so-called civilization? Right? What does it say? I would also ask that you consider joining us in recognizing that, again, Western history's separation of every aspect of human intellectual activity and behavior, the built environment, and so forth, separating that from nature, which has caused the dams and the global warming and so forth that we're all responding to, must not be replicated in how we address those things. We can no longer afford to separate the lived human experience from what we're aspiring for the environment. That would be making the same mistake on the other side of the rotten egg, right? Because, again, Katrina was the disaster that should have resulted in billions of dollars of federal money for coastal restoration. It proved that cumulative land loss, ocean level rise, climate change, unsustainable metropolitan, developments for it's just unsustainable, and we needed to at least protect it better with the natural defenses that we can. But we're always a disaster behind. BP happened, right? The Macondo well blew out. Well, that's the one that resulted in the Restore Act, which, mind you, there would be no Restore Act if citizen groups in the Gulf Coast hadn't, like I said, been thinking like a river and coming together, those who do social justice work, those who do environmental work, those who do even, which non-advocacy type of, what do you call that? There's a word for it, service work, right? In coalitions, right? And those among us who are familiar with the Clean Water Act, right? We're like, hey man, this BP's gonna be paying a lot of money, might not be enough, but they're gonna be paying a lot. And this is gonna be going to the US Treasury and not back to these states, right? If we don't get the Clean Water Act amended so that 80% comes back here under the Restore Act, which we lobbied and got passed, knowing full well that we were asking the federal government to give the biggest fees we could think of, right? Billions of dollars, so that we could then work ourselves ragged watchdogging that money, right? But that's just necessity. That's the lay of the land where we live. Now, like Katrina, BP was not construed as a social disaster. It was the flip side. It was solely an environmental disaster. If you've noticed, there's been a shutdown of all discussion of the cultural displacement of Vietnamese, Native American, and other multi-generational fishing communities. I mean, they're the last people to go. After the American farmer went, the people who ply, the waters, particularly the the Gulf of Mexico, apply the natural resources of this North American continent with their own hands to build their own local institutions and communities and fulfill, what is redeemable about the idea of the American dream, right? Have been robbed of that. People have gotten terribly economically displaced, culturally, I mentioned, and the public health impacts, you never hear about it. But they too are epic and severe, and it'll be decades, right? Generations. the fishery, maybe toast, you know? Anyway, we collectively failed to think like a river in that instance after DP, like we did after Katrina. And I hope that Turkey Creek is an example, an instructive example of, at a local scale, right, of just converging and bringing in every imaginable, possibly relevant, useful resource, ally, idea, because as we speak now, the Federal Interagency Working Group, Region 4, its priority is to get it right in the Turkey Creek watershed and the city of Gulfport. We've got port expansion issues and HUD stuff. That wouldn't be possible if people were remained in their boxes, right? If the lawyers and the urban planners that we brought in weren't cross-fertilizing, right? If the civil rights advocates weren't becoming more environmental, if the environmentalists weren't learning better how to, you know, interact with, you know, the people in the community, not just the birds, not that Mark ever had a problem with that. You know, Cajun boy from New Iberia, he knows how to deal with people. But like my mother said, you know, if people make a circle that excludes you in some way or another, make a bigger circle. I think that this is the path to justice and self-determination and vitality and sustainability of communities and with this planet. And so, you know, I welcome you to do that in your own practice and in your own lives. And also, I would be remiss to walk off this stage without mentioning that I look forward to the possibility of maybe hearing from someone or someone's in this crowd about the possibilities of working with us in the Gulf region. And the reason, one of the reasons I'm going to throw the Gulf region out there as being particularly important is it's almost like the miner's canary, right? It is like the devil's front yard, right? It is the gates to Armageddon, you know? If this was World War II and, you know, the Allied forces were trying to knock out Hitler from the West, unfortunately, you gotta make beach fall at Normandy. And this is Normandy. Whether they think, look, all the coal that I hope the Northwest could block going to China will be coming down the path of least resistance, right? Through Senator Vitter's Gulf South, through Senator Shelby's Gulf South, through Haley Barber's Gulf South, former Senator Trent Lott's Gulf South, right? As will the tar sands. All of these pipelines lead to the Gulf Coast. So the 31 states, you know, drain the pesticides and the other unclean waters that make their way to the Gulf. The Gulf is like Turtle Island's severely diseased liver, right? It really is. If the Rockies are the spine, right, the Gulf is down in the abdomen, catching hell. And sending back really bad stuff for the rest of the folks to contend with. In terms of our national energy policies, our U.S. foreign policies, you name it. And it's nothing new. That goes back to the beginning of the Republic, right? And the inordinate amount of influence, right, that these original frontier states, or, well, even the colonies, the deep southern colonies, have exerted over our federal laws and national culture and politics. So I look forward to the possibility of hearing from some of you because, again, the Gulf Coast is the place. The tar sands, the coal, the sea level rise, persistent poverty. These are perennially the poorest states in the country. That's why the stuff goes down. They're the least educated states in this country. They're the least healthy states in this country. It's a third world human rights crisis zone in this country that is plugged back to every other place in this country. in more ways than I have time to go into. So think of the Gulf Coast, if you will. Turkey Creek being just emblematic of sister communities across the Gulf region that can all attest to what I'm saying. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming. I just wanted to remind you that tomorrow daylight savings time starts, so it'll be bright and early for the final day of PIELC. Good night.